just going to text you a playlist. We just have to hold the meeting like this.
Yeah.
Hang on, I should turn off the blur.
Oh, it's your music, not mine.
Sorry.
No. It is. I'm going to shut that. That's too much light, isn't there? Turn that down a bit. I can never get the lighting work in this house. Yeah, it's interesting. I had a good session yesterday. The one thing I can't do is I can't make it work with any of my glasses. There's not room to fit them with the back bit on. And funnily enough, if I hold the headset really close in, I can get into focus. So I find I need to do it in small chunks, and then I get. It's not sort of the thing Peter mentions. It's not the motion. It's actually just reading stuff that's slightly out of focus gets a bit,
I've had a problem with that too. I ended up getting the click-in lens things.
All right.
And they cost £100, which was not obviously both got each, but still, that was annoying. And it helps a bit, but it doesn't help 100% because it's still a little bit about where, it's maybe a focus and maybe not this. And
well, also I basically wear what they call computer glasses, which are the sort of, it's like the sort of gateway version of varifocals. So there's a slight difference. So basically this and this are different, but I mean, they're not insurmountable, but I'm rather sort of logging these things as I go in a sense, because they're not, I think it's a takeaway I learned from, the years working on systems at sea that were in a set, you might say, incomplete designs, in that inside this beast was something that did what it was supposed to do, but it did it in the most horrendously human unfriendly fashion with sort of sharp bits sticking out. And it's that sort of thing of, well, because I know what happens. Someone says, well, we'll sort that out in Mark II. And of course they never do, because that's now another department who don't care either. And it becomes one of those marvelously somebody else's tasks.
Yeah, this is, of course, what's going to be a big deal with the Apple device. This stuff will be big.
But you see, I mean, I carry these around. Well, you'll have seen them before, but these, they're French, and then they do them in half steps from 1 to 3. So, but that covers most of the people with sort of late middle age, reading distance degradation. In other words, you can get these out in the tube or something just to read a notice. That's what they're there for, or reading, labels on the back of tins in the supermarket. But I don't know what they are. I mean, you can get them in other shapes and things, but they're 10, 20 quid a piece. So why you can't, in a sense, why you can't get cheap reading glasses. Now, if you're wildly astigmatic or something, that's a whole different ball of chalk. And I can't remember whether she's plus 10 or minus 10, but my wife's eyesight is really bad, and you wouldn't expect most things to cope with that. But for a majority of people, basics are reading, basic reading distance correction, I think is something we've had cracked for years. So it's the kind of thing where that's a really interesting design oversight, because it wouldn't have been possible. It wouldn't have been difficult to build a bridge to literally just drop in some corrections, which probably would have increased the sort of standing audience by a significant proportion. But, all part of the experience. Hi, Adam.
Yeah. Adam, do you have perfect vision or something, Mr. Show Off, with no glasses?
Nope. I use lenses, contact lenses.
So we were discussing the inability to get this to work with these, which on one level is a first world problem. And, this is early stage, but I was just musing on the fact that you can easily I buy these marvelous French readers, because they're even smaller than those, and they eventually break in the middle. But for, a few euros, it means I can read the labels in the supermarket if I forget my real glasses. And I would have thought that would have provided, because they're just uncorrected. They do between 0.5 and 3 in half-degree steps, and there's no different eyes or that kind of thing. But for a lot of people, that's pretty good enough, because I find that in the very limited use, I was getting eye strain. I wasn't feeling any of the nausea, but I can quite understand that some people do. But then again, I spent a lot of my youth at sea, so I probably passed through that stage. Because actually, funny enough, and pertinent to this, I remember going to, it was a Tinderbox weekend in Hanover, and someone kindly took us to they have a ship simulator where people come to learn how to basically drive super tankers and things. And one of the programs they have is coming into Hamburg Harbour, which, like Rotterdam places, is big, complicated, and busy. And one of the programs he has is for tug drivers. So we were stood inside this thing, and it screens all the way around, and you stand on a little dais, which is effectively the bridge. And he said, right, well, let's turn the weather up to 11. So we were in a snowstorm in Hamburg in failing light. And several people with me clearly were beginning to feel sick just watching the screen. So I totally get that there is a graduation of that effect.
Indeed.
So did I get it correctly, Mark, that you have an Oculus? Tried it now?
Yeah, so and I've got it all working. Another interesting thing was because both bits came together, I happened to open the box that was on top, which is the smaller one, which is the battery pack. And I very nearly ripped part of it off because the instructions, no one had thought about that, because the diagram of the back headpiece looks not dissimilar to a face mask. So he said, basically I was trying to remove this when I should have been removing that, which was something in a different box. But the person who'd written instructions hadn't actually thought through the problem. Hadn't said, step 1, get hold of this bit. That's quite another bit of interesting poor industrial design.
And I don't get it. They spend so much money on engineers and the engineering side, and this is kind of low-hanging fruit, designing better packaging, involving good interaction designers. They should put just as much money on that, but I don't. For some reason, management is blind to that kind of.
Well, it's a bit like, if I was funding stuff now, I wouldn't fund any AI group that didn't have an ethicist who wasn't a coder paid to be in the room. So that all the time there's someone leaning over the shoulder saying, look, mate, as long as you do that, as night follows day, something bad will happen. So fix it now. Don't punt it down the line for somebody else. And in the same way, if you're doing the industrial design, someone will wheel their trap to you and said, those steps really aren't going to work for many of your customers. You need that, and it's there in us all, because we elide away the things that are inconvenient, because I just want to get the thing, I want to get the thing done. But yeah, and that's an interesting part of this whole thing. And one of the first things I did was actually cast the picture onto one of my screens, because I wanted my wife to look at it. So I knew she'd had problems because she's got a very poor eyesight. That's quite interesting. So this is someone who's been, a signals officer and then a lawyer, corporate lawyer all her life. So, sat on multinational billion-pound pension boards and things. So not exactly a slouch, but sort of basically said, yeah, it's okay. Yeah, fun toy, but what does it do? The only thing she did notice, because she did actually try it without her glasses, it was all a bit blurry. She liked the basically onboarding room you turn up in. She thought that was pretty cool. Yeah. And I got her to look at the sort of bounding box, which I actually think is that's really nicely done. But it's, again, it's that interesting thing, because I'm thinking, well, if I can't communicate to someone else who's a perfectly sort of, educated grown-up, bearing in mind that the gist of the conversation wasn't, this is games, this is technology we will be using, not necessarily in this form, but in the future. So I think I've got some explaining still to do, but that's a nice challenge to have.
And I've tried it with very iPad literate kids, but who has never been in not really in 3D worlds and not in multiplayer things. So it's very interesting to see their first reactions to putting the headset on. They grasp it very, very quickly, and things like rays coming out from the hands is kind of they grasped it within seconds, so that the ray coming out of the hand hitting something far away is a kind of a pointer and it ties back to what Barbara talked about, that pointing is a very perhaps even a genetic thing that we are born with the ability, or very quickly, to construct a model for pointing, and so that was very interesting to me. But we also had a very interesting incident yesterday. Rebecca and I, we tried out Mozilla Hubs, the slightly more open mini metaverse thing that Mozilla has been producing. So I was on my laptop, and Rebecca took the headset because it's cooler with the headset. And then I had to leave the room. And when I came back, Rebecca was on the chair, because we were in a world where a microphone in the virtual world, was high up. So she climbed the chair while in VR to reach to speak into the microphone to see if it was working. I was so horrified by that sight, because if she falls, she will be in the virtual world, falling on to real desks.
That's by a big virtual cushion went underneath the chair.
But it's really, you really get immersed in that world. When Frode and I did some experiments as well, and when I came out of that world, I immediately went, and we were in the conference room, I immediately went and washed my hands, because I felt that I've been in a foreign environment, and I'm so used to washing my hands when I come out of a conference room or something with people. So
thank you for highlighting. It was not just because you were with me.
Nope. And also other things. I pointed my switch chair pointer to and it got stuck in Frodo's chair, and it felt really horrible. I didn't know what was going to happen if I was going to be placed in Frodo's lap, and that would have been, it triggered the awkwardness of real life, that it would have been a very intimate thing that neither of us would have.
So I made a note that we clearly need a hand basin when you come into your room as well, so you can virtually wash your hands on arrival.
This is actually part of the discussion I had with Vint yesterday from the whole NISO thing. And because he said, who do you know who is who in a virtual environment? And in Jaren's book, because he goes back talking about the 70s and 80s and 90s, he's saying before the internet, you go travel to a city, you didn't know who was who. I guess it'll evolve in the same thing in VR spaces. In some places, if it's a meeting room for an office, there will be verification for who's who, even though you may look like you're wearing a funny suit. Like today, I'm wearing a hoodie. I don't usually wear a hoodie, but that'll be the same kind of thing. But then you'll go to a club and you can accidentally sit on someone you don't know who they are. So the evolution of the social spaces will be very interesting.
There's a degree of culture in that as well, isn't there? I mean, some people are just happy to rock up and meet people they never, in a sense that, okay, there may be cues as to who maybe has sort of higher status in a certain group. But, it's interesting. I can imagine if you worked in a broadly sort of engineering or quite structured background, you almost acquire the need to know who is who, because otherwise your karma is also bent out of shape. But actually, it broadly doesn't matter unless you're having to interact with someone where one of the four people in the room has special skills and you don't know which one it is.
Well, it's funny, Mark, because I've never met Adam in real life, but being in the other room where we walked around and we could draw shapes in space, which was crazy. It was a very ugly space, fine. But at some point, we'd end up being really close, face to face.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not very nice, right? Which is hugely interesting. It is that sense of presence. But two other thing before I forget. Number one, I've pasted in here a link to the universal control thing, which became live today.
Yeah.
I think that's a hugely important thing, because I think Apple will leverage lots of different technologies together for VR. This glasses will not do everything on their own, which is, it's very, very interesting. Also, I had one of those, oh my gosh, what is VR good for? In specifics today, not is it? That's not a question anymore. And I looked at two different things. One of them is the, I'll briefly share my screen if you don't mind. So I went into my software called Author, and I did this. So I started, mapping out us, like Mark Anderson, journal, newsletter. Oh, that's Alan here. That kind of stuff. Because I thought if we can't, because the article that Peter sent was interesting, but the whole conclusion, what's the point of doing 3D stuff if we can't even work in 2D, which was really annoying. But fair enough. I should be able to start doing something in 2D that I can imagine we then take into 3D. But what happened quite quickly was, so let's look at Brandel here. What's the point of me just having him here? You know, if we actually worked in the same company, we had departments and stuff, I'm sure we'd both be in some kind of a box. But what would be interesting here is there was some kind of a feed. So if Brandel did something, this thing would update for me. But I think that's slightly out of scope. So what I thought about then was, please don't read this because it's just my weird notes. But so Adam managed to take the Future of Text book as a PDF into this Mozilla space. And when you went close enough, it was incredibly readable. You know, one of the things Vint said, people won't go into VR to read. I think he's completely wrong. I think people will, because one of the magical things that I only also understood today is very narrow field of view. So when you move your head, it's an infinite space almost. But when you don't move your head, it's a concentration space, which for me, with my issues, is actually really, really good. So that was one thing. But then I thought, what is the key thing that, you know, we all have to look at what kind of work we want to augment. And the kind of work I want to augment, if I'm honest to myself, which is hard to do, it is the act of authoring and the act of reading. So therefore, and I really want to know what you guys think about this, what I think should be done is, first of all, currently an author, concepts are per document. If you start a new document, you can copy the concepts over, but they're not there by default. So first of all, make the concepts part of the system, not per document. Then add a few, very, very few things, such as category. You click on that and you have person, location, institution, a few basically tags, but you try to make it very few. You can allow people to add a tag manually, but make it a bit difficult so they don't do it too much. And then finally, we have here time. If it's a famous person who's dead, might as well put in the born and died, right? Could be useful. So point is, if we are allowed to, because Notion and Roman, of course they all do it and they're all better than this, but if we look at it really simple way, if these things have categories, and then Adam, who took the document and let's say he manages to get the visual meta out, that means that we should be soon able to be reading a document, and we can then do things like this. See only the defined concepts, you know, pull them out and do all that kind of stuff. Here, I haven't defined very much, but because we know what's in it, we can start doing really powerful views. So sorry for going on and on, but in closing, if we can help an author in a normal environment write and define stuff, then automatically when they produce the documents, it is in a way that when it's taken into VR, you can read it in a really flexible way. I think that'd be really powerful and interesting. Oh, final thing I forgot. If things are defined concepts, when you point to them, the mouse should change to a pointer, even though it's not a link. You know, we have to find a few affordances like that. But I'm really wondering what you guys have to say on the notion of that kind of document workflow. I'll even mute myself for a minute.
I think having the concepts defined per sort of workspace rather than per document, it sort of points to an interesting question of, in the context of hypertext, what constitutes a document and where are its limits? You know, because it's a view, and the idea of view specs and any other sort of manifestations of it are that that there are specific kind of trails, and that they are in a lot of ways there's less integrity, and I don't mean in a pejorative way, to what is this document versus that document when you have this collection, this loose collection of ideas that you want to kind of put together. The challenge with that is that sometimes you want to say different things about different things, and so having something that is a canonical reference to Doug, for example, is challenging unless it's the kitchen sink. And so I definitely like the idea of being able to create documents and have a source of truth for things. Yeah, it's making one's own hypertext or Wikipedia at some level, but at the same time, because of the specificity that one might desire at various times, that's something to look at and think about the sort of practical consequences of.
Just on reflecting on that, it is really important that I consider these concepts and glossary the author's point of view, not at all any kind of truth. And what becomes interesting over time maybe is you read my document that has this, but you also have your own glossary. So you should be able to say, this document that's in front of me that I didn't author, show me only the glossary terms I have defined in here, because that's what I'm interested in. So what I'm looking for here is, I think it's the same wavelength as you, where we give the system stuff to work with. Right, so here's my defined stuff, there's your defined stuff. We have citations and so on, and then we can build, because over the last week, I've been going a little bit crazy thinking in this VR space, we can do this and that and all of that. But as Mark keeps hammering on about, and is completely right, where's the data coming from? Right, so how can we then introduce data to this in a comfortable manner where we feel like we're nicely building when we write, and similarly when we read, right?
I think one approach that is fruitful here is to not work these concepts into a database, a kind of central store of truth, but see it more as the sum of all documents, or a part or a slice of all documents. So you could have your, I've said it before, but I don't want my tech references creeping into my theater references, for example, or very few of them. I don't want to see them. I don't want to see that the other way around. For example, very many of my theater concepts and the embodiment parts of it really relates to VR. So I want things from theater coming into my tech world, but not the other way around. So it's, and also personal stuff. I want to separate that. So having you maybe that is what you call categories, but slices of your document space to draw from, rather than being the source of truth, but more that they are options to draw from, would be a way to approach it that I think is fruitful and not explored enough. In tech circles, there is this kind of idea that you put everything into one big database, and you have been working on the idea of the document as a canonical truth, and I think that your version is a bit more interesting because it automatically has a sense of time as well. A document was made in a time period, and it may be relevant now, but it may be not. So slicing things by time and category is very useful. Yeah, over.
Yeah, I see you had, Mark, but just to respond to that, when I was doing this earlier on, I wanted to be able to let the user, if they're a high school student or university student, specify whether it's for maths homework or music or whatever. Absolutely. But then I'm thinking more about the kind of thinking and sense making and all of that stuff we're talking about. That's why it becomes more unified. But I really don't mind having a little tag in the corner that says, you know, this is for such and such space. I think that's absolutely a legitimate thing to do. Yeah, over. I'm mocking this up. Well, that's my. I'm not looking funny while I'm listening to you guys. Yeah, no.
So I've written down 3 things. I mean, interesting. I think my first reflection when you started was probably being covered mainly by Brunel. In that, I mean, just one of the problems is, of course, is how these things scale outwards. And the truth is, we'll never really have the time and attention to detail to want to classify everything in this, and that's the problem with classifying systems. But I like the concept that certainly, and it so also shades across to what Adam said, that it's not unreasonable that you might say, well, look, within my docusphere, my personal docusphere, which might be all your documents here and out there, but broadly in some way yours, which is to be defined separately, that you could say, no, well, this is my known constellation of facts and interesting things. And if they were structured in a way that they could be shared with people, that's also useful because, as rightly said, well, where is the canonical version? And to a certain extent, there doesn't necessarily have to be, because one of the problems with the all-encompassing sort of database is that, you know, well, we all end up in some sort of religious war over what the grand truth is when it doesn't really matter. You know, we won't even agree just to have two truths in the same wrapper. Not that it, you know, it really doesn't matter, but, you know, it as on a human level, it's clearly something we just don't do very well. Having made our choice, we're hard to budge. But I mean, I think it's good, and I like the hypertextual nature of it. I think it's also interesting because it has an innate sort of link or an inferred link structure, even if it's not actually there, which is important if we want to effectively move around that as a, I don't want to call it a network and I don't want to call it a graph, but if we want to move it between interconnected things, we want to be able to sort of teleport along the lines of connection. That's quite interesting. And that's the kind of thing that we might begin to be able to do in for instance, in a VR space. It's harder to do on a 2D presentation. I may be wrong even on the latter. On data, I mean, the reason I bring it up is all too often data at the moment is basically just the exhaust of our activities, and we think, oh, there's something interesting in it. There aren't many people you see who actually sit down and plan their data, and I don't mean in something like, you know, international organization planning metadata, but this is something I fell into. I got asked on a university project, and I was staggered. There were 60 funded projects, all funded by a national funding thing, and not one of them had a description of really their understanding of their data. Their entire approach was, oh, we're going to be making data, and because we'll have lots of it, it's probably important. So what we want to do is we want to have intellectual property rights over it, but we don't really know what's in it yet. And well, that's where Wendy asked me to stop helping. So this is an inconvenient truth at this point. But I find it hard to walk away from that, because, you know, that is one of the things we're facing. And so a really interesting thing in the context of our sort of, you know, C-level discussion about VR spaces, well, does it make us think about how we design data that will be helpful to us? That, for instance, to be able to translate from this flattened thing to this to a richer structure. You know, it's a bit like this thing about going from a complete hypertext, you know, linearizing a wiki. Well, how do you do that? It wasn't built to do that. I mean, you can, as a sort of author, you can choose, well, I will take this path, but it's the same sort of thing. So, which is one of the ideas I did play with Noda. And yeah, it's fun and it takes me to get used to. But what I really wanted to do, my next impulse was, right, I want to take a data set that I have and I want to dump it in here. And I want to see what all those little, you know, and yes, I'll start with 2,000 circles. But I sort of know, you know, I'll know some labels, and I can begin to do stuff. But it's interesting that I don't think people are thinking like that. And one of the problems I think that comes out of that is that you get over fascinated with the interface. So, you know, there'll be endless ways to have different colors or different shapes, but no thought as to what they represent, to why you might want them to be different shapes. So it's not that the work, you know, it's impressive work and it's all stuff that needs to be done. But again, you know, that is the implementation level stuff that I think we want to skip over and say, well, that if we can take that, if we can take it as granted that probably by the time we need it, that kind of stuff will be better. So what is it? How should we say take your constellations, your glossaries, and put them into a space, so that the map you were just showing us in Author is something that is actually useful to us. Because in effect, if it's just a 2D map in a 3D or ND space, we've moved it from one environment to the other, but we haven't enriched it very much. And so that's sort of, I take on that. And the last thing was another interesting aspect, because time was mentioned, is that, and this comes to me often when I'm looking for a book, and it's kind of trying to find out that if a book was republished, if I'm trying to find a book that's been recommended to me, and it's been republished, well, has it been republished and altered? And I don't just mean the typo level correction, because you'd sort of expect that, but did they put an extra chapter in? Or, you know, so in a sense, am I actually talking about the same source or not? And again, that's something that is very, very rarely picked up on. And I've also put in the sidebar, I think Freud's read it, but I'm really enjoying a book that, on the face of it, is supposed to be about translation, and it is. It's called Is That a Fish in Your Ear? But in the course of talking about translation, it inevitably gets into the, well, you know, is there as much fixity in language as we think there is? Not really. You know, can you define what a word is? Well, you can tell a computer what you think a word is in terms of, you know, it's things surrounded by spaces or punctuation. So it's really nice to sort of dive into the same ambiguities, but just from a different direction, because it's almost comforting to see that exactly the problems he's bringing up are things that actually are not unfamiliar to me, having looked at it in other circumstances.
So I think we're all kind of on the same thinking here. And one thing I went through a couple of weeks ago with this definition dialogue concept blocks was to very easily and quickly import Wikidata. And it turns out not to be that hard, but then suddenly I think we're inching very close to a universal truth rather than someone's glossary. So what would be really interesting from my perspective is to build, you know, I do this side of things with your input, but then when it goes into VR, if you extract the visual meta, of course you have other access to lots of other data too. So if you choose to say, you know, here's Doug Engelbart, to use that example again, you know, you want to see the Wikidata about him and whether it contradicts, or if it's not contradicting, you should be able to literally glue it together as one thing, and that'll help you with the rest of the space. In other words, you start with a corpus of some sort, but you can expand and go here and there. I mean, I really think that if this were to happen, Ted Nelson would just start crying. Yes, Mark.
There's an interest, I mean, because it keeps bringing me back to, I mean, I've consistently failed to get Chris to understand what I meant, because when he did his sort of Tableau, his Weblo thing, and I said, because around the time I was back when I was doing my thesis, I was talking with Dave Mallard, who's one of my supervisors, and he, I think you've now seen in the group here. And I say, well, one of the things, that's all very well. I mean, I can go around the links on Wikipedia and that tells me what people bothered to link. What I'm actually interested in is saying, well, if I jump into a subject that I know of but don't know, so I don't know economics, can I look at it and see where the holes are? I actually want to see the anti-patterns. I want to see where the dark thoughts are that don't exist. In other words, I know there ought to be something about the subject, but there isn't. Or the ability to sort of take from Wikipedia, said, no, I want this node, this node, this node, this node, and then the rest can sort of fade out at the edges. The links are also there, but I want to look at these objects, the interrelation of those. And that was, whereas what Chris was doing at the time was in a more deterministic way, just following the structure that was there. One of the things I suppose because of things I've been doing, one thing I've been used to doing for years is actually basically, you know, forking out the data, literally forking the rubbish out, having it and just saying what's there. And is what's there what the person that gave it to me thought it was or said it was? You know, what they've given me, does it actually represent what they want it to be or think it to be? But I mean, very often the first answer to those two is no. And it's not through anything bad. It's often people just don't understand the nature of the information they have and how it works. So more often than not, that's one of the reasons their information isn't working for them, because they don't understand the nature of it. They think it does something, or they think it's produced to do something that they want to do. And in fact, it doesn't do that at all, because it's structured or interrelated. So this thing of being able to sort of take information without necessarily sort of tearing off all its links. For instance, if you grab a handful of Wikipedia, I don't want it necessarily to be sheared off from the rest, but it can, you know, going back to the Oculus boundary type thing, well, it's outside, I don't really care. And if I need to move my boundary out or, you know, bring something into the space I'm looking at, that's fine.
I think,
but otherwise, rather like Adam's visualization, the rest can just gently recede into the background.
I think that brings up the question of what does Adam and Brandel want to build so we can support them with work and ideas and stuff in this context, if anything. I mean, I would love to see an incredible reading space that's focused on one person but can easily incorporate more people. But what do you guys actually want?
Well, something that I built over the last couple days is a multiplayer VR page that also supports multiplayer 2D views of being in the same environment.
Randall, is it an Oculus? Because all four of us have Oculus now. If you send a link, we can go in.
Yeah, I mean the latency is probably not amazing. I've just been experimenting. It may very well be that something like Mozilla Hubs is a better basis. But what I wanted to do was understand it from the ground, or as close to the ground as I can be bothered doing, so that I can kind of stitch different sort of signals and systems together. So that's been fun and something that I want to do. But again, like I said, sort of more at an infrastructural level, and to have essentially a boilerplate of techniques and approaches to be able to explore these smaller things. And my intention is to be able to sort of connect with two devices at once, because at this point, speech recognition isn't something that you have direct access to in Quest while you're in the web. You know, one of the things that Noda does is it has a limit because of the way that it's actually needing to make use of a paid service. So it needs to clip the ticket on along the way in order to do that. Whereas Google Chrome actually provides a speech recognition system gratis that you don't need to have any, that you know, Google's probably listening to your speech, but other than that, it's something that you can make use of. And so that's what I used in Word Reality, and you don't have the ability to do that on Quest. But if you have your headphones, if you're wearing these headphones and those connected to my Mac or PC, and then I'm in there, then I'll be able to have both hand tracking, full hand tracking, and the ability to do dictation and speech recognition and stuff. So that's something that I'm doing for the benefit of being able to kind of think about what it is the text input is, and the sort of the multiplicity of representations the text can have. You know, I'm really interested in where you put text. I think that that's one thing that Noda does, but I feel like it's actually under indexed, is like being able to more effortlessly place text in places, and also to be able to replay the sort of temporality of when text was put in places. There's a really neat guy who sort of took over the department at UCSD, I think, from Ed Hutchins, and in HCI and Cognitive Science Department, which is a really neat sort of mixture of things. And I watched his CHI Lifetime Achievement Acceptance speech from 2015 recently. One of the things he talked about was the fact that computers are wonderful context destroyers, but they should also be wonderful context restorers as well. And so something that I'm really excited about is the possibility of being able to encode actions such that you can kind of get into the swing of and recognize what it is you might have been thinking about as you were doing stuff. And it sort of comes back to something that Mark was saying earlier about what is useful data to encode. Something that another person in the VR community recently was asking, and I think I know what kind of kick they're on. Avi Barzeyev was at Apple, was at Google, all of those places. But like, how many apps record all of the temporality of your actions, in the sense of having something like an undo queue, but recognized and elevated as being more constitutively significant for the purposes of being able to understand what a document actually is. There are some things that are represented as a series of steps, serialized, in the way that, for example, Houdini, it's an application for doing production film effects level computer graphics. And that applies a series of procedural steps so that you never sort of lose that. But it's not the history per se, because it's not necessarily a reflection of the way of the timing that you undertook those actions with. And GitHub does exist, but it's not actually a fully granular representation of those things in those orders. And so, one of the things that I'm interested in is going, well, what are some of the artifacts that we natively, what are the attributes rather, I guess, are native components of the artifacts that we're typically interested in producing, and what manner in which can they become represented in a context for either scrutinizing, sharing, or otherwise thinking about the things that we already expect to make. So, to that end, I like the idea of recording just in normal 2D apps, the sound and the speed with which you type a key, so you can hear somebody really smash it down, and also the rate. And I think those are really interesting sort of experiments. But that's, while flippant, also representative of the kinds of aspects of performance and the characteristics that might be recordable and made meaningful within a spatial environment as well. So I think that what I want to make is enough context, one, to be able to kind of give recognition to the fact that all of this stuff is pretty achievable and pretty easy, especially with the right boilerplates in place, and two, to say, to Mark's point about what is the data. A lot of that data is stuff that we probably wouldn't have thought of as having the ability to be meaningful, and at such point as we crack that and make recognition that it actually could be a useful thing for us to respect and understand, we'll have a pretty significant step change in our relationship to that data, and recognize that a lot of the things that we're putting in and saying, this is a document, are pretty impoverished. So that's a lot, but that's an answer.
Really cool. Yes. The richer stuff we record, the richer stuff we can interact with. Absolutely.
I comment briefly on just one thing before we go to Adam's take on what he wants to build, just because it speaks directly. But just one thing on the time. One thing that we tend to overlook, and because it's easy, well, we measure the things we can measure, which is quite a natural thing to do. But what we don't actually measure, or because we don't tend to record, is intent. So the classic thing is we'll type 100 characters, pause, 2 characters, pause, 3 characters, pause, 5. So basically the third edit is the 3 typos you corrected in the 100th thing. So actually what you want to read is not that, the important bit actually isn't the 100, it's the 3 edits after it. Now, of course, that's not obvious if you're just looking at the character flow, because unless you actually have an understanding of what's being changed, you've got to read right into the language, which says to me one of the things that we should be a sort of skill we might wish to acquire, and a new sort of literacy, as it were, is get in the habit of accepting that our input processes are not always as good as they should be, and our mind wanders and things. But it's sort of recording just in the way that actually we've recorded in a separate vein, having something. So when we're having this conversation, you can always tap a button and say, important thing happened here. It's exactly the same, but in one's own work, because we can record the flow of the characters going into a document, and we can know that, yeah, yesterday afternoon I wrote a long section, or I wrote a number of documents. But it gets us that far. What it doesn't quite answer for it is, oh, did I actually write something of real insight then? Because to do that, I'd have to go to that time frame, find that thing, and get into the language of it. And I don't have any answers in this, but I just sense it's come up across my bows a number of times now. And the one thing, I suppose it seems alien because we don't do it. It's self-evident to us when we look at our own work. But we don't record it in the moment, and maybe that's a form of data we should build a receptacle for. And I'll shut up then because we want to hear what Adam's interested in working on.
You started so many interesting things that I want to discuss more here before. But when I've been playing with both the Mozilla Hubs and a little bit in the workspace Horizon thing, and but especially Mozilla Hubs, and when dragging things in there, placing models and placing documents in there, is that it's obviously clear that there is no kind of greater collection of things. You import either the whole world, you go to a world, or you have small singular objects, but the collections are missing in a way. Of course, you can import a room or something, but it's kind of there is almost no data or more detailed information in there. And I've been looking at the USDC, the Pixar, and also Apple format for models, the open format, and it's very 3D centric, model centric. But because I've been thinking on how to hang on extra data, metadata in it, and it looks like it's really hard because there are just very small primitives, but we need some sort of bigger collections, like that this model, that part, this cube of this model, or this image represents this and has an hyperlink, or and has this date stamp and timestamp and human, all the data we've been talking about today, and much more. We want to hang that onto the model, different parts of the model, and also relate different models together. So as when you bring two models in together and they happen to have a relationship, that you can visualize or show that relationship. So we have some work to do there if we want to have a kind of a metadata format that we can hang on to 3D models and do something a bit more useful with. And also the collection part, to have a document, the 3D document, if it's a kind of a montage, or even with a space, a gallery thing, where you have some kind of a substrate that you put the knowledge objects on, where it must be represented and encoded in a way that is, and I envision something that is as easy as HTML inspectable, something people can actually work with and really learn quite quickly if you're IT fluent. Or
my hope would be that it would actually be HTML. I think I agree, Adam, about that. Like the question of like, where is meaning, and I don't feel like USD does it in terms of qualifying relationships and stuff. And so either you add that to USD, or you just say that meaning comes in, and there's sort of a ground truth inside USD, and actually all of those relationships, constraints, and those kinds of things that define potentially interactivity, but certainly meaning, come through in another format. And frankly, it might as well be HTML.
It could be, and there is a question of, do we have a wrapper around where the model is part of the and we point into the model, or is it that it's, or is it inside that file, and can they coexist within one kind of a specification or a file? But what we really need is very addressability, so we can address everything with a good precision and describe it. So every stroke, or every form, or every little triangle, or whatever it is, so we can address everything, or most things, so we could do a mapping between the visual representation and all the other things. Another side note here, or another thing, is that when I walked into these Mozilla worlds, I feel like the future must involve some sort of running code as well. That the object must be living and do things, that you bring in kind of the machines, that you bring a machine with a visual representation and other representations, bodied representations, or but also that they can do things. You bring in a tool that is both visual and a tool that does things, either produce new things, or convert things, or enlighten you in some way. So we must have running code. We can't just have lots of flat things, or models, or 3D models, or forms. They must do something in order to, and we must think of a way that, of course, we have the problem with security and sandboxing things in public spaces, but at least in private or high trust spaces, we need to have powerful tools that are visually represented.
Absolutely. And I think we need to start segmenting things because, yes, if I want to bring in a propeller plane, like a toy propeller plane, into a room, I should be able to do so. You know, it has a simple engine. It doesn't do much, but it is not a static dead object. So I think it's very, you know, it's a representation of what you're talking about. I think that's really important. And some of us this week have been talking about Apple's open dock approach, where you have kind of a dead dock, but you put in the tools. That's obviously very related to this. But I think if we're going to try to build something together to demonstrate, I think we need to look at who wants to put in what effort and for what. One thing I do not think we should do is to try to build a system of universal knowledge graph connections. That's something that nerd communities seem to do a lot. You know, if I represent my world exactly and you represent your world exactly, we plug them together, we understand each other. That is, I can see all the shaking of heads here, that's just silly. So I would very much hope that what we can do is bring in different data types and through translators or whatever we might call it, have them talk to each other. So for instance, a concept map from wherever, and then we have Wikidata here. Does it connect or not? It should be almost a manual thing, because once you have too much automatic stuff, it goes too much outside of the brain. Not that machine learning and all of that shouldn't be used, but Dave Millard used the term intentional. The concept definitions in Author are intentional. You can't just tag something, you have to write what it is. So I think in this space too, it's useful. Especially because the power of this is immense. So we can very easily overwhelm ourselves. To bring in 1 million Wikipedia articles is soon not going to be a big thing. To have
towards the end. This is always the question. Is so it's in the demo sense is, so what are we demonstrating that we can't do, and not just that we're doing it in 3D. But why are we doing it in 3D? Because we can't do it in fewer Ds than that.
Yeah, so exactly. So I think we need to design, you know, many people here will be doing many things in many worlds, but what will we do together? I think we need to design that, you know, we have the few people in a room, what are the things they're supposed to be able to do?
Yeah, well, one thing that I, really like in Sketching User Experiences by Buxton is his attention to some of the early work on the description of focus plus context, and that recognition that reading a newspaper, this was on back in the 80s, and so most monitors were sort of 320p or so. And so he sort of likened reading a newspaper on a computer to having a very small sort of cutout through a piece of paper that you are then scanning over an entire broadsheet, and it's perfectly adequate for a form of reading when you're actually looking at column inches and you're scrutinizing a particular story or scanning through its classifieds. But it does nothing to the context picture of what is the thing that I want to kind of lunge in and read at this moment. And there were hard cliffs in terms of the capability that one had to be able to display any of that by virtue of the low fidelity displays. We simply didn't have the pixels to represent those things. But those things are going away, and so we have. But most of the way that the terms that we interact with computers on are at that sort of final level of zoom for the most part. And I don't mean in a literal sense. There are things like zooming user interfaces, but they've also failed to recognize that concept of level of detail is not merely physical scale. It's not that something is bigger or smaller. It's that something is at different levels of granularity and fidelity based on the intention for representation. Like, what is it that you intend to do with this document? And to that end, what are the levels that are important? Something that I was playing with a while ago before I got sort of not distracted, but pulled into virtual reality representations. The timeline stuff that I did for linearizing timelines, I did before I was playing with the VR. And then I was like, oh, this can work in VR, and it has different characteristics. And I think that's an important thing, not to discount the possibility that some things simply the dimensionality really does confer benefits in terms of your manipulation and interaction with it. But one of the things that I was really curious about at that time is the question Mark was saying about what are the thoughts that aren't thought, but even simpler, like if I've been to this page and this page and this page in Wikipedia, what are the other things that means I should probably read? Can I get a reasonable summation of those links? And one of the challenges with Wikipedia, I just looked at the economics article, it has an out degree of 2,900 to 2,700. And those are not all the same in quality. You know, one benefit is that one thing that you can do is look at the number of times that a concept, you know, because you typically only look one page once in a Wikipedia article, but that's not to say that the concept isn't reintroduced time and time again. So, you know, one of the things you can do then is to look at the number of times the term in and out link is reused in order to qualify that link, identify what sort of relative importance it has, because something can be peripheral or something can be central. You know, if you're reading about economics, then simply the fact that it references Adam, like there's only one link to Adam Smith, but probably Smith is important if you're talking about what economics is, versus say Alec Baldwin. I don't know if he's in the economics article, but you know, probably fairly peripheral if you're talking about that. But yeah, so that's something that I think I want to do, and that's something I think that is important to recognize as a job for virtual reality, is being able to come up with these multiple layers of abstraction and give visibility to the fact that there are these different ways of thinking about things like level of detail. One of the points that occurred to me while people were talking about the objects is that Pixar and other people who are involved with creating objects in 3D like this are, I think, pretty poorly positioned to recognize that what they're throwing around are a whole bunch of almost entirely empty signifiers, that there are things about those things that matter, and they matter to different people for different reasons. And absent an ability to imbue that information to those things, those objects, those elements tell a story vastly thinner than most people would be expecting to be able to tell with them. And so, you know, I think those are significant challenges and problems with sort of spatial and dimensional kind of representations. But I think that they're also really interesting provocations that can lead to some really transformative perspectives on what it is that data is, what it is that navigation is, and the way that meaning can kind of be manipulated in a way to make these things useful and fun to play with. That's a lot, sorry.
That was great. So my tiny little initial point was, in some ways, reading a newspaper on here may be better than a broadsheet, because broadsheets take up a lot of space. You know, you basically need a table for them. So that's the wrong kind of concept, context. You know, where it is on a page doesn't necessarily matter much. But I think the other thing you said about, let's take Adam Smith. I really want to be in an environment where I'm reading Adam Smith, and because I'm doing something with economics, I select that, touch it, lift it, whatever. And then I do a Wikipedia search or whatever, and then the results come up, and then I have an interaction to say, this is actually about that. So that it kind of mentioned it earlier, but that means that in the future, as I go through other things, all that information is now verified as being that. So, you know, to see important people in time, all of that then comes automatically. So to build the opportunity for that kind of connective space or constellation or whatever, I think is important, because I think what we're working on here is not to build a visual sculpture. I think what we're working on here is much more meta than that. We're working on here to build the opportunities to constantly rearrange the sculpture.
Yeah, something that I've been really conscious of, sorry, I promise this is short. In the context of spatial computing, is that a lot of people are just woefully under-indexed on how much kind of needs to be revised about what we think of as information in order to be able to make the best use of the medium. And so that's why, you know, when I listened to Vint, you and Vint talking the other day on that YouTube chat, and you know, I don't think he sees it. And I think that part of that is that the value proposition of computing per se, if you accept it wholeheartedly as it is right now, then there aren't that many advantages, because we need to do a lot more infrastructural work in order to get those things forward. So, you know, I'm glad everybody else sees it again.
Black and white, completely agree. Guys, Mark, Adam, whoever.
A couple of quick things. One, just on papers. Actually, when you had up a phone, I thought, gosh, that's the last place I'd read a thing. I mean, because always at the weekend, Saturday, I read the Financial Times and the Times, but I probably read I read the Guardian and Times online most days. But I always know I'm getting less than I get in the quotes real paper, and that always bugs me, because it's a bit like, and the worst of all is the BBC News, which is now just all sort of lifestyle faff, and it used to be a real source. It was a trusted world source of knowledge. So I'm not sure actually that it gives us the granularity that we want. Mainly, I think that's due to probably a fairly low-skilled layer of people who are doing filtering on the news. Anyway, that's by the by. The thing I was going to mention was, so an interesting point, and I think this is probably when Brenda was speaking earlier, I was thinking, well, gosh, so we're sort of talking about annotation. So I'm looking at some things. Sorry, this might have been when Fred was speaking. I lost track. But so when I'm looking at these things, or I follow these links, one of the things I'm sort of doing is saying, oh, right, actually, this is pertinent. This isn't. And as I spent a lot of time in Wikipedia, mainly trying to understand the difference between what people had actually written and what they'd intended, is that, yes, and it is a technocracy, and that's one of its weaknesses. So everything's sort of seen through, yes, I can measure it, but does it do anything useful is the question people then tend not to ask, which is totally different to the argument, the sort of humanist argument about whether they agree what's in the written word at the end, which is a whole different ball game I don't want to get into. But so the sense of, okay, right, yeah, there are 3,000 outlinks here, but which are useful? Well, I could annotate them in the system, but then that would probably be a separate bit of warfare, because as my research showed, people don't like sharing. You touch my shit and everything kicks off big time, despite the fact that notionally it's a commons, because basically people want ownership. So I'm thinking, so what one may be doing there is you're sort of making trails. And this goes back to when I saw Chris's demo 5 years back or so. So, oh, that's what I want to do. I want to basically take things, and I was thinking in a sort of 2D space, but it could be more. I want to grab that, I want to grab that, I want to grab that, and I want to put them in a clean space without cutting them off from everything else. But I just want those bits in the Petri dish so I can look at them and I can understand the interrelation. And I think that sort of speaks back to what you were both saying earlier. An interesting point about Wikilinks, and we didn't get mentioned, but it's another thing that happens here, is when we look at things like other people's intentions, we're often guided by, again, our appalling habit of counting things. So it's a classic problem. If enough people follow the same bad link, it's the most promoted. Well, that clearly wasn't quite what we meant. But we haven't generated the systems other than basically humans coming along and fixing it, saying, no, you're following the wrong thing. I mean, short of removing the link, it's really quite hard to do, and we haven't dealt with that issue either. Which means that measuring links or measuring use of links is very often infelicitous and gets us to exactly the wrong outcome. It's the more subtle thing of being able to look at things. So, you're looking at Adam Smith, you're thinking, okay, but what are the things related to Adam Smith? So I don't necessarily need to know if he had a collection of gnomes in his garden. Interesting, but not pertinent to the fact that I'm trying to understand maybe his philosophical take on something, or some aspect of his life, or how he relates to a subject. And they're all in there. They'll all be in a corpus, be it in the Wikipedia or something similar as a hypertext. But you can't see the wood for trees. People don't write links with the sort of hypertextual intention that we're talking about. They write it within the style guide of Wikipedia, which is not well written, but it's mainly done when people stop complaining. You've done it right until somebody else starts complaining. And it in a sense, it is that poor because it's a complete open commons, which makes it actually a very bad study model, I've come to realize, because there's so much unintentionally unuseful human behavior that's a skein of noise over what's a fascinating data set. The trouble is the data set has been accumulated without necessarily a lot of careful thought, and it's just full of the amount of half-finished stuff. But there's no index to it. The index is nearly all actually brute force single word match. The categories, it took ages to discover anyone can make a category. So you go to Wikipedia and say, I want everything on economics. It'll give you the economics category, but that is certainly not everything on economics. If you were to look at all the documents, it'll just be whatever somebody tagged out. And these are real interesting, sort of tricky things to do.
Let's not go too far into the plumbings of Wikipedia, but the issue of
no, it's the meta issues, it's the hypertextual issues. It's Wikipedia's. Yeah, don't get lost in the subject matter. The point that the important thing is the lessons that it shows us, and the infelicitous way in which it leads us away from the understanding and the sort of visualizations and the way of displaying information we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, to that end, I would say that there are aspects of sort of data that can be measured for things. Like I've mentioned, Google has the ability to measure bounces. So when you visit a page and then you return back to the search result from whence you came immediately, they know that that's a bad sign, that was a low value resource and reference, and that probably it was elevated too high.
But not necessarily bad business for them that you come back to their ad page. So it's
that's correct. That's correct. Yeah. But say in Apple, where I do have some level of dominion over that things, it's something that I make use of. It's when people have when people return off of pages, when we have bounces, we know that something about what they did is not in line with what we want to be able to give them. And I've heard a lot of people talk about these implicit behavioral measures. So something that people did on Amazon Mechanical Turk back in the day was they would look at various aspects of the way that somebody was performing a task in order to come up with a sort of automated assessment of the quality of the answer, based on the time it took to do it, what kind of mouse movements they had, because they found in broad strokes that it was possible to make assessments about that. They're not 100%, obviously. For example, somebody using accessibility assistance is going to have a completely different utility profile of the way that they're making use of aspects of the site in terms of cadence of their scroll, that kind of stuff. But I think that there are an incredible rich plethora of signals that can be used in 2D, and I think that expands only ever outward in 3D. It butts up against privacy and all kinds of other aspects of it, to the point of Wikipedia, what are valuable links. One of the things is how many people follow it, but also what is their onward behavior after that. If it's non-economics-ish, then you know that it's not necessarily useful. So there are ways of doing it. It depends on what kinds of capabilities you're willing to bake into a system with regard to the aggregation of data and reporting of it, what sort of privacy implications that have. Things like differential privacy do some job toward providing the best of both worlds there. But yeah, I think that there's more we can know, and there's even more we can know in spatial, providing we're eyes open ethically about what implications it has. And I want people to know that.
So I raised my hand because I want to save the statues. Frodo wanted to resculpt the statues, and I want to be a proponent for actually saving the statues a bit more. So when you do some knowledge work and get a search result or bring in a few documents full of links, I want the actual search results to be objects in themselves that you could scratch off, take a list, and if you get a search result, you could remove things from that and save the actual result as an object. And I think 3D is in a way good for this, because in flat interfaces you have a kind of a nested doll of many different spaces. So if we look at the operating system, many windows, and if you look at the zoom window, it follows its own logic and physics and so on, and it has menus, and it has lots of icons, and they are different. All these things are different spaces. It's not one unified space with one logic, but 3D has more opportunity to be a bit more unified, in that the place where you went from and the target where you went, the results of your search could actually be placed inside the actual same space, and that it brings up very many new opportunities to unify the interfaces. No more menu bars or scroll bars, because you don't need a scroll bar. You can just look up and down and get the length of the document but just by glancing. You don't need a tab bar because you can look around the document to see the other documents in the same stack. So many of the this goes back to what Peter wrote in the email about that article about I think actually 3D is better for many things because we're so limited with the screen, so we have to do these kind of imaginary toolbars and other spaces just to navigate and so we need to or we are forced to do things a bit more hypertextual or interactive than they need to be. But in 3D we have so much space we can actually place objects and sources and show the history of where we went from and where we went to, and that forms kind of a sculpture, a knowledge sculpture that I actually want to save. So I don't want to recombine it. I rather have the next time I come back to the same sculpture, I may take a copy of it and put it further away at a arm or a walking distance or a glanceable distance, and then I can risk it. So I can, just as designers do, they copy the object in Photoshop and do it hundreds of different variations, or a sketchbook with hundreds of different variations. To me, it's very important to see things side by side, the juxtaposition or glanceable differences. That is where I derive so much value. Just having a timeline scrubber and a history is not enough for me. I really want to put different states between besides each other in juxtapositions. I really need to see it. Could be because I'm very visual. I want to see things side by side, but I think it also ties into what Barbara firstly talked about, that animations can be very bad because actually putting the different steps a bit more visualized before you can lead to greater understanding. I think it is like that for many people, and so I would like to have the different variations of the statues beside each other. Yeah, over.
Well, that was really nice, because you kind of said we disagreed, but of course we don't. Now, Mark was mentioning earlier how his wife really liked the basic room inside Oculus. You know, I go to the Japanese room and it's really nice in there. It's really, really nice. So I put down a few notes here. Number one, about the sculptures. Yes, we should be able to save them in many different ways. You know, I consider that publishing. That's why I really like documents. For me, what document means is an intentional, here's a thing that I've now framed. That's all it means. Rather than a continuous time stretching of modifications of it, at a certain point you say, okay, that's that, or that's that. So that's what I mean by document. I'm not saying it has to be a rectangle, but also we need to look at where we should focus our brains, because there's so many aspects, but also in a kind of a real thing, we should start guessing what kind of APIs will Apple, quote unquote, give us. Right? That's a really important question, because I'm sure when Apple comes out with stuff, they'll provide incredible developer tools for people to be living in their world. You know, that's what they've done forever, and that's what they have to do, and that's all well and good. So obviously with Brandel's deep knowledge of, and also Adam, you're getting there, of web and other VR tools, we have to really look at what our opportunities are. And just as a slightly side issue, I could imagine in a few years putting on my whatever and being in this Japanese room, but I can actually walk around there. So imagine you have this one floor that is my office and meeting room. So I know I meet you guys there, I have my library here, whatever. You know, I lay it out like a normal space because it's a mind palace partly. But then I can go up on the roof, and that's where we're kind of in infinite space. So it's like all the Wikipedia is there. All of this is there. It's like, wow, you know, everything is here. But mentally, we need to be able to be boxed and unboxed, obviously, right? So if we just have the complete freedom of VR without thoughts, it's overwhelming. But if you imagine some kind of a structure of crazy everywhere, specific rooms, the floor below, but then we have a basement that's kind of like plumbing. It's like the deep library of the stuff that we care about. It's almost like our settings and so on. maybe we can start thinking about issues in some sort of a way like that, but also focus on, right now we're in a meeting. One of us has published a document of whatever that means. And the rest of us are able to go through to try to understand that. I think it would be really useful to get to a point of what that might mean in our community.
I would like to add another space, and it's kind of the void or white paper or white room or black room or gray room, but the really, really empty space where you could bring in to get that kind of focus. Of course, you can do it in your Japanese home, and it may serve that purpose for you or for me as well. But the really blank white canvas is sometimes very, very fun to start with just a word or a sentence or an image or a model or two things side by side and nothing else. Maybe your tools there.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds wonderful. Mark?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brando.
Those were the first 4 environments that I made for Word Reality. Was a lakeside and the pass through to the extent that was available on Vive, and then a pure black and a pure white sort of space that you can just kind of exist within and be able to kind of observe. It was nice, and I think that those are really valuable kind of things to be able to separate and live in for different reasons.
Yeah, I think those blank spaces are good because it came up actually in a separate. It was a Tinderbox week last week. But I was just thinking on the fact of matter and dark matter, and dark knowledge certainly far exceeds defined knowledge. So there's lots of knowledge out there we haven't discovered yet. But we constantly focus on the stuff that we think we know anyway. And so what that often makes difficult is to sort of look beyond. So these blank spaces I think are really good because they're extensible and they help train people who tend to always think inwards, to just expand the horizons a bit. So I think that's sort of tremendously useful. And I just wanted to pop it. It's a slight by the by, but I watched Brett Victor's most recent talk. But there's one interesting thing I took away from it. And I'm beginning to see it as a slight trope now. So, if we did this, we could walk around, everything. I'm thinking, have you ever been to a museum or a weekend where you say, let's do 4 museums over the weekend? And actually, I know you're only walking in the mind, but there is a sort of slight misunderstanding. So that's another thing. I get what's meant behind it, i.e. that you can see this thing in a separate space. But it's interesting at the moment we're using some, no pun intended, some quite pedestrian terminology to describe the way in which we might pull these things apart effectively into just a separate environment. Then reality would come to you rather than you go to them. I suspect.
So I'm raising a hand again because I want to push you guys a little bit on would you be interested in the Visual Meta VR thing? What I mean and what I'm asking specifically is if somebody authors a document with Visual Meta as a PDF and puts it somewhere, do you find it interesting to parse the Visual Meta as part of how you can present a document in VR space? Because if you are interested in that, then you can, of course, co-invent what this would mean in terms of the Visual Meta and the interactions.
To me, it's very unclear what that Visual Meta is. You say that I can put anything in there, but then you're talking about metadata in general, and that is useful if it's useful metadata. So what kind of metadata are you actually talking about? Can you give example that would be useful to you so I can?
Yes, I would. I couldn't imagine anything I'd rather do than tell you that. The different kinds of metadata that documents can contain and that Visual Meta supports include structural metadata, which is essentially headings and page numbers, so that you can choose to divide the document up by headings because PDFs usually don't have that. Then there is contextual metadata, which is what did this document cite? So that's the references. but connected to where they are in the document and an addressable way. 1 second. Yes, I got real quick. I'm in a really big meeting. I would like this one.
4 people.
Yes.
Big ideas.
Big important. Yes. This one.
Hello.
Okay.
We are the big meeting.
Where are you
Okay.
putting it? Where are you putting it, Aga?
On you.
Okay, cool. Right. So that's a really core, but I'm realizing more and more that the defined term / glossary is really, really important too, because I really feel that as we massage our knowledge, let's use the term again, sculptures. Thank you, darling. To help us think so-and-so is so-and-so. That's actually really useful for people trying to understand us, because it is very much about intention. This is what we intended to write. So that's why one of the views I already have in Reader is only show me headings plus defined terms, because that's what the author cared about. So that could be one of the views that in BR you could say, put everything in the background.
Because there's a really it's a really interesting thing in doing that too, because if in doing that and you're looking at, say, the headings and the defined terms, you don't see as the person who's authored the document the reality of the document. It argues one of two things: either you didn't do enough definition of terms, or we may need another sort of object that wouldn't sit well as a sort of defined concept. But you see, in other words, there might be another strand of object that we need that exists as another bit of metadata, like that allows the story. And I don't have an example in my mind, but I just know sometimes you may think, yeah, but that doesn't really, this thing is not a concept really, or it's not a person or a thing I can really describe, but there's an important idea.
So in the defined concept dialogue, I'm looking at what kind of additional stuff to put in. Like the type would be private and so on. This is what you guys mentioned earlier. The tag would be person, institution, that kind of stuff. So the question is, what would be useful here? Because the whole idea is that the whole dream for me is you have a rectangular document. So if you're actually reading it, there's probably no better format than having a rectangle with beautiful type. To really deep read, that's fine, as long as it's laid out nicely. But then you can't read all the documents all the time. So you need to just choose what elements to look at. So if you're reading one long document, you should be able to put it on a timeline, which this kind of thing can do. Or you should be able to say, only show me the bits that are about people, which this can do. And then, of course, if you are dealing with a corpus, like the hypertext proceedings, if all the documents have this, then you can see, I want to see everything where they refer to this time period, or only about institutions, or only about that. So you start moving the things around. And when I talk about PDF visual meta, it doesn't have to be. There's no real reason we couldn't export this as HTML as well, right? I would do a PDF as a backup because it's plain and simple. But the point is, imagine all of us like to tinker. We don't do paper and plastic airplanes anymore. But if we had the time, we would probably be building model airplanes, wouldn't we? Right? Because you put them together, it's really nice, and it just feels good making that shape happen. Imagine providing a piece of software environment where it's pleasant to do that, because it's not just for your brain. It'll go into an environment where other people reading will have access to all your beautiful little details here and there, and they can thread them together. Does that answer the question a bit more, Adam, on what kind of metadata? Because it's not limited to that. If you decide that another type of metadata is useful, we should look at how to make that happen.
Yeah, I think I agree with your last vision where you build something with your small notes and your personal reflections and share it with the world, because I feel that I don't do that. I build it for myself so often. I have lots of things and I have so many. I work with improvisational drama, and I've done a large number of exercises and refined them, and exercises really need the commentary to be useful. You can't just do an exercise. You really need to know why you're doing them, what you're practicing, what you're looking for as a teacher, and so on, and all the small details that it makes it useful. You can't just read a game and understand the beauty of it, but sometimes you can transfer the beauty and the things to look for. But and I want to share that, and a book has never been there is no linear order to these exercises. They are more clustered, and I want to have other canvas for it. I've been thinking of doing big posters, but it's kind of hard. It will be a few meters wide or big, and hard to send to people, a poster to read and so on. So
VR is a little bit perfect for that.
yeah, but it's a perfect playground for it, and also I like a bit messy sketches that leaves room for the audience to think. Perfect things are a bit, and drama is that as well. The good drama is lines you write in your mind as an audience. These are the best lines. An author can never match those lines, what you think. So good drama is in the silence, and the silence is where the audience writes the lines. So I like sketches because it opens up the audience participation into things. And so I would like to have an object or way of transferring these sketches and the ideas are small anchor points or chords that plays a tune that's played in the audience mind. So, I'm really against the knowledge graph because knowledge is by definition inside us. Knowing things is inside us. The people talk about knowledge as it's outside, and I think it can only be inside us, and we can have chords or anchors to knowledge in our information system, but we can never have the knowledge in itself. And I think there is a confusion. It's not good to speak about knowledge in that way because it misses the smaller details that you evoke things by those anchors. It's not the knowledge itself, and we need to be more precise with that language. But and I will want the instrument or the document. It sounds dry, but the document to send to other people. So that part I want to have, Frode, but I don't see the connection to the current PDF and visual meta is not clear because we can go directly for that kind of a rich knowledge object and not be limited to the very, very linear and kind of the destructive nature of PDF, and in against the technology here doesn't feel useful to me when HTML is already beating PDFs in so many dimensions. Even now it's even getting fixed layouts, and it has metadata you can hang on directly onto text. So why hang it on a page in the end in a typographic format? It doesn't make sense outside that purpose. I really understand why it's good to print it in the legacy world of PDF, but I don't think it's a data one. I want to have the data in a undisturbed form, so I can not work against the technology and actually do the kind of representation we have been talking about. So I think you print to PDF, but you should not have that as a data source. So I think a PDF is just like the models we have here. Maybe we can attach a model, but the metadata and the data, and I want something pure to project from.
I would answer that differently. Sorry, Mark, I'd love to weigh in. I do find the idea of the metadata as presented in visual meta to be a useful and interesting thing. One issue that I have is that I'm not from an academic background. I barely scraped through my bachelor's degree, and so I don't have the same sort of relationship to writing in particular. I had a blog for a while, but I kind of gave that up after coming to Apple. So I don't have the same relationship to sort of navigating large corpus of text, either for writing or even as much to that extent for reading. I read more than many, but not nearly as much as an academic. And so I don't have that as a basis upon which to sort of build a relationship to the sort of representations of text. That said, one of my fairly methodical processes for playing with stuff is going like, what data is available, and then by that token, what representation do I wish to try to pull out of it in order to be able to play with it. And to that end, I do see the representation that exists within PDF. Again, I wouldn't use it in an application that's leveraging PDF, but if necessary, copy paste or export to HTML. I would look at, and I started looking for BibTeX parsers for JavaScript, such that I should be able to kind of pull those things in, so that I can then take a look at what it is that I might want to represent with that. One of the things that I've been doing with this infrastructural multiplayer stuff that I've recently is trying to build out a sort of a fruitful enough foundation to be able to build those applications on top of. And so, it is my definite intent to take a look at parsing visual meta and thinking about what sort of representations spring out to me as being interesting and useful for the benefit of being able to kind of navigate and parse a document. But based on where I come from in terms of my relationship to text, bibliographies, those kinds of things, it's much thinner, and so I don't have that same kind of basis on which to reason out of the box about it until I get my hands on the ability to actually parse, process it, and think about what significance it might have.
That could be my thing as well, that I'm not. I did my master thesis 12 years ago or so, and I haven't looked at the diploma since then. I haven't done any writing, and also I'm a non-native English speaker. That also puts an extra layer or block here. I read a lot of English things, text, but I don't write it, and that's why I'm reluctant to write for the future text as well, because it takes me 5 times as long, and I need an editor in some way, or proofreader, and we don't have an abundance of proofreaders here because everyone wants to write and wants to proofread, I think, or more people want to write. Yeah.
Okay. I gotta jump in back. I gotta put my sword in and fight on this one. So really, really important. First of all, linearity is really important. Really, really important. You cannot have academia without linearity, because linearity is making an assertion, making a point. This is one of the first discussions Mark and Chris and I had when I started at Southampton. I was all about make it all hypertext and everything, but then you don't have an argument. This is something that Barbara also talked about. A graph or diagram is fine, but it doesn't tell a story. And this is why it's so bloody hard. Like the thesis, the last couple of months, I hardly wrote anything, but I couldn't think of anything else. It's really, really hard. And I'm not saying we should make those long documents for everything. That is not what I'm saying. But I'm a little bit now polarizing myself with what you said, because I'm very much agree with what you're saying, but just for balance, a sentence has to have grammar, right? You can have the word yes, no, fine, stuff like that, but anything else, you need grammar. And that is the basic importance of text and speech. So if you have a longer piece, you need some sort of a threading, right? So what I'm trying to write about the piece that you hated, the kind of manifesto thing, it's really, really hard to write, especially in a community, but it has to be a little bit of an intro. This is important, but does it have to be always one linear long thing? No, absolutely not. A lot of that can be moved around. A lot of it is arbitrary, no question. So the whole balance of how do you make a linear statement and how do you put stuff behind it is really, really crucial. This is where I think we as a community really share perspective, because we talked about newspapers earlier. I don't read newspapers very often. Economist and a few other things, partly because it's so shit the way it's written. The story has to start with John walked the dog outside and it was rainy, a bit of personal fluff. And then he saw it was the end of the world, right? So it's like, I would like machine learning to get rid of that first bit. And then it's bad copywriting with lots of repetitions, right? This is not good linearity, right? But you need to find out what happened. So if we can manage to get closer to a little bit of a statement and connect it, that's why I'm so on and on and on about the concept stuff. I want to be able to write. I had a meeting with Adam today and we talked about VR. We decided blah, blah, blah. If most of those words are defined, including Adam, that means that the reader can see, it's Adam Byrne, who is he, blah, 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 right? This is really important, but I still have to write that one sentence. And going to the whole visual meta thing, I do not think that visual meta would be a very useful format inside VR. Absolutely not. But what I do think it is a bridging format, because it's ridiculously open. That's all I'm pushing for with that. It is, you know, every kind of thing should be able to go into our VR rooms. We should be able to do the kind of drawing we did. It'll have meaning. VR will be, visual meta will be useless for that.
But isn't HTML even more open in terms of tooling and the actual ease of getting the data in and out of it? It's so interesting that I feel when I start with VR that I can hang things directly onto objects, or that I can in HTML that I can hang data or metadata directly onto texts or paragraphs and even characters if I want to. I feel and the tooling for that is so much better than when I worked with the web 10 or 15 years ago. Now you can even make your own tags and it's fine suddenly.
Okay.
And it's a new world to me, coming back from theater, coming back to computers
okay, let's fight over this one, because I think what you're saying is actually wrong, because it is hidden, right? You don't show the HTML, that's hidden away. You show a rendering of that. That's where, to me, it gets kind of dangerous. And I guess that's why we have this markup stuff, which is kind of a hybrid, right? Because yes, you can put a lot of stuff into HTML. That's really, really useful. You put the data there. But then over time, when things and tags and meanings and renderings change, that goes kind of away. That is my concern.
They won't change though. I mean, they mean what they mean. I'm not sure I buy that argument, actually.
Well, if you look at older pages, especially if they have some kind of multimedia or stuff to do with them, even basic stuff, like look at 9/11. A lot of the stuff that was to communicate what happened on 9/11 is completely unviewable today.
But that's not to do with HTML per se. That's to do with interim technical format. So the fact that you can't watch a video that was shot in a format that's not supported now is actually nothing to do with HTML per se. That's a failure to preserve digital formats.
It's not just about that. But okay, so the thing is, okay, let's not argue about this too much, because in principle,
but if we have an EPUB, which is a HTML version of the document, so it's a fair fight, because I feel that you're talking about the kind of going back to a Wayback Machine and trying to browse a video. But if you have an EPUB that is a fixed thing, a document you own with a known format, fairly compliant, the data is still there. So the question is whether it's visually represented to the user in some way, like your last page. Last page is with the visual meta, but that is also rendered. So it's rendered. So there's question about being shown to the user, and that's where I'm with you. Metadata is often hidden, and then we don't fill it in because it's hidden, and we don't care about any. It takes too much time to fill in forms that things that are hidden. But if the metadata had been the first page, the cover page of your EPUB or thesis, you would make sure to fill in the fields because that would be the first impression of your document. So I think it's more about actually showing metadata and make sure that people fill it in. And that is also an economic problem or an organizational problem and a problem of motivation.
That chimes with the fact of sort of an awful lot of data being the exhaust output rather than actually intentional output.
Yeah,
and the fact that it's hidden. I mean, this is partly. This gets back into all sorts of cultural divides between sort of the humanists and the technologists and all sorts of things that are actually completely pointless distinctions to draw. I mean, it's basically the problem with something like metadata is it involves something you're not used to doing. which means to most of us extra work, and most of us don't like extra work, and it pretty much
No, but
collapses down to that.
Mark,
Sometimes because it's not made easy to do.
Mark, most of the metadata in Visual Meta is free. It requires no effort at all.
No, I understand that.
Which is
been
a real-
deliberately done.
There's nothing filling in. You fill in your name and the title. That's all.
Yeah, but
Yes, because it's
some
been
of the
designed to abstract.
metadata in HTML, the like headings and so on, it's there by default, of course, and it has more pristine text right now. It's not as bad as it was 20 years ago when in character encoding. I have some special characters in Swedish that always were mishandled, and that is a Latin script, which is far better than all the others in the world, except for English. So I think,
Okay, well, fine. Let's not waste too much time on this aspect of it, because Visual Meta is slightly archival also. But for you guys, let's say you're talking to me as a software vendor, somebody is an author doing a thing, and now they want to have it in a VR space. Would you both prefer that it is rendered in HTML?
So I don't have a preference. Like I said, I'm pretty promiscuous as to the data sources and the representation. So long as I come up with a mechanism for parsing, I'm not concerned whether it's represented in BibTeX Visual Meta style or if it's in anything else. As long as it's consistently parsable, it's something that I can make use of. I think I actually think that this sort of discussion / argument over HTML versus other formats is not a distraction and actually central to some of the discussions that we ought to have here. In that one of the issues with HTML, as kind of Adam pointed out, is that its job has changed over the years, and so what matters about what is represented within it has led to this rot. We're talking about a range of things, and one of the things I think that you did very reasonably, Adam, is comparing an EPUB HTML to another fixed document, because link rot is a separate question, but representational kind of deterioration is the thing that we're talking about in terms of what ceases to make things relevant. That preceded, James Bridle has a really good book, a good bit in, I guess, in the New Dark Age, where he talks about the fact that the BBC produced a sort of a Millennium edition or something for the Doomsday Book that was all produced for the BBC Micro in the 1980s. And now 20-something years later, 30-something years later, people have to have a digital archival and retrieval sort of rescue effort for the BBC Micro thing. Well, the Doomsday Book is just as readable as it was 1,000 years ago or whenever it was written.
Yeah.
And so, I think that, sorry?
So most of the early hypertext literature now can't be read. All the stuff
exactly.
in Flash is disappearing.
Right. So I definitely agree that these things are imperiled, and that's one of the reasons I believe that Vint is so excited and enthusiastic about having such a bare bones thing. One of the challenges with it is that it has the exact same inherent dangers as HTML in terms of representational flexibility. The fact is that HTML has done so many different things for so many different people that you end up with these garbage documents in terms of being able to parse, because it's doing all of these different jobs at once. There's been some level of effort in terms of trying to separate, people talk about using handlebars versus JSON, JavaScript object representation, notation, in order to make sure that there are these things that remain separate. But for the most part, the things that are delivered to people as final documents are these disgusting interminglings of data and representation, and all of those representations kind of vary with the changing winds of what people decide to be able to put into a page. And so, the saving grace to some extent of Visual Meta as it progresses is the sort of the ideological purity, the functional purity with which it may be carried forward. And to sort of that end, I applaud it, and so that sort of comes back and as a broader sort of restatement of, so long as I can parse it, then it remains useful to me. But it's contingent on that parsability, and that's where what you're talking about within the context of HTML and its challenges. It has fallen down over the years. The reason why Wikipedia is such a great source is because it's comparatively clean. Again, comparatively, it's not consistent. And as Mark will attest, no data source truly is. There's always a lot of plumbing involved in these things, a lot of janitorial work, some people call it.
But I mean, there's an interesting to draw together some threads here. I mean, first of all, I would say, Brunel, don't think you're not up with the hunt in terms of academic stuff. I mean, I've come to the
No, I
reason-
don't.
I mean,
don't
I think
that.
a PhD is merely a sort of long attendance award. It's just, can you get to the end? Because as Fred said, a lot of it's just sort of thinking, mainly not thinking about anything else. But it's one of the couple of things I was thinking about is in relation to say doing some visual meta is. I think you're absolutely spot on. And what I mean, for instance, the visual meta is at the moment has stuff written in BibTeX because the initial use case we were doing related to academic citation, which is a side thing, but it's just something that happens. But it's not organized as a corpus such that you could just put a URL on everything, if only. Or even a URL that didn't immediately die. So it has this thing. So, I mean, BibTeX is quasi-parsable. It's like it has several different religions that live within it that don't talk to one another, and so the parsing is a tad more complex than you'd want. But it was. I remember the discussion at the time. It was a bit like going back to doing things with PDF. The point was, if you look at all the other formats we've got, it's the only one that is effectively, I guess, non-mutable. And part is you take a Word document or something, do you know that it won't get changed by a process? So a PDF is broadly, for better or worse, baked in. That's the upside of it. Pretty much everything else is potentially a downside. With Visual Meta, the fact that it's using BibTeX is basically we had to choose something. The biggest heavy lift at the time was doing the academic referencing, which argued and it was basically a choice between that and a thing called RAS, which make your eyeballs bleed, but just in a different way, to BibTeX. So it wasn't exactly a stellar choice. And I always maintained from the get-go that to anybody prepared to ask or listen was, it's there until we find something better. It's not there because it's good. It's the least worst of the available choices.
And it's simple.
Which gets to your point that, and my thought, in my involvement in it, in sort of where I tried to contribute into it, was exactly what you said. Look, if it's parsable at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. The biggest error we could make is to produce something that just can't be parsed. So if I have to, look at it as a legacy device, and even if I have to go through several levels of parser for the really old stuff, it's not lost because we can track back, and we won't need effectively an emulator, which is a whole different kettle of fish. So I think that's there. And so the interesting point about using Visual Meta, I think speaking to Anna's point, is the thing I'm thinking interesting about that is the in and out. Can I take Visual Meta, put it in visual space, and get something useful from it? It's not that we want to look at the actual data. We will be wanting to look at a render of the data, but we might want to do something. Maybe we might, for instance, want to look at the glossary and the interrelation and sort of Freud's authors like concept map. That's sort of there it's a 2D map, and it probably is going to be a sort of 2D-ish map, even in 3D. But you'll be able to interact with it more easily, perhaps. But also what you can take back out. Because an interesting question is, well, if you can't, then we've got more work to do on Visual Meta. I mean, if it's a sort of if it's a sort of Roach Motel where the data goes in and doesn't come out, that is a problem to address. A couple of other things I'd say is, in terms of Visual Meta, Freud's thesis is effectively baked off now. Mine's done, and if I fix the issue with the ligatures, we've got a couple of bits of large metadata, Visual Meta, that we can just play around with. The point is, they're as complete as they can get. They're from known resources. You can talk to the author and say, what the hell did you mean with that? And then, for instance, I'm perfectly happy to take that and, for instance, put more concept map data, which I probably do manually, simply because I can't put the whole document into author at this point. But it wouldn't be difficult for me to take the Visual Meta that's attached to that and enrich it with some more stuff, such as if it might have come from author, and simply to allow you to look at it and say, here's the thing, what can I make with this? The answer may be nothing, but if that's the answer, that's actually really powerful. That's all pertinent to what we're doing here, because part of this thing is, well, how do we take what we have and put it in this new space in a way that's useful? which also makes me think about scope and size, because necessarily often people start with really small representations because you're just trying to make the damn thing work at the outset. But I am thinking, well, how big should we be finding some bigger bits of data? And that's an area where I'm happy to help, because it's a job in itself.
Yeah.
That detracts from the build. Just having the thing that you put into the thing that you make is a wearisome body of work in itself. So if we can usefully do that, I'm really happy to help. And to that end, I still think some of the data that's within my overall citation data set might be useful, because, for instance, we could play with that on a linear, on a temporal scale, and get somewhere close, for instance, to the cytology article I must have mentioned moons ago. And it may be that even having done all that, that proves to not be useful. But I think the answer is we won't know until we've done it, because it gets back to this problem is there's something really exciting and interesting in having this wider space. What's unfortunately less clear is what's useful within it. Which doesn't invalidate the fact that it's interesting, but it still makes it difficult to know what we're going to do gainfully within it. I'll shut up and let Fred speak.
I'm really appreciating everything that's being said here, and it's lovely to fight with Adam on this, because it's a good kind of fight, because obviously we agree on the end goal. So I wrote a few notes here, and I think maybe the top one in terms of VR is this is something to smuggle things past the gatekeepers. Right? There will be different kinds of data gatekeepers and all kinds of things. So this jokey definition of visual meta as being just writing what the document is at the end, I think is really, really important. And I'll just put my notes in there. It is far from perfect. It is missing a lot. So all the kind of stuff Brenda was talking about earlier, getting the key presses and the sounds and all of this, absolutely fantastically useful, right? All of this stuff has to happen, but it's a different thing for different use. To open that in VR from Author or whatever software, yes, right? But just to get the basic stuff, here it is, I framed a little thing and this is what I want the world to know about it. Please, can you software-wise read this stuff is really, really important. And also, so it's been mentioned, the whole link rot every once in a while. Just to say the obvious thing, citations are different from links in that they don't actually give you anything. They just tell you how to find it. So when we talk about different levels of referencing, a citation should ideally open up something for you immediately. But if it's missing, it'll contain enough information to help you find it elsewhere.
Well, it also tells you what it is, because it predates links when there weren't links.
It tells you the attributes of it so that you can go find it. But I think we should look at that same kind of thinking for other things. Not necessarily something that's cited specifically, but look at, kind of how to describe things. Anyway, yeah, so that's why I'm asking. There are many, many things we need to do, but I would really, really like a workflow of somebody sitting on a laptop, writing some stuff. They open it up in VR, and the way that I mentally picture it now is, we have the fake VR laptop, and you take an instrument on top of it, and it scans that text, and suddenly you have the data. Just a way to make it.
The data, how? It has the data, but
what I mean, imagine this. This is me being really dumb on purpose, right? So you're in Horizon's workroom or whatever. You have your virtual screen. There's visual meta on the screen. And you take a piece of software that is an OCR scanner, and it touches the screen and it reads that text. And that is how the data goes into that room.
So I think we're at cross purposes. No, the bit you've described is just translation. I'm not confused about that. I'm saying when this data has got from your laptop file into the 3D space, then what do we do with it?
Well, that's where it gets really fun, because Adam today, he put the book in space. So it's just a rectangle, just flat. Mm-hmm. But then a lot of the stuff we talked about earlier can start to happen. Like, I'm sorry for going on and on about it, but the whole concept thing, if the author has defined certain things as having certain value that is connected, that can be then literally taken out and be put in a space. And if you have Wikipedia behind that, for instance, that can connect as well. So, you know, Doug Engelbart, so-and-so, oh, he lived in Atherton. Atherton, okay, it's a location. Let's do a map thing. Where is it on, you know, you can go on and on and on. But these are the points where you don't have to go page by page. You have all these elements. You have the citations, so you can draw in everything it cites. If the concepts actually list people, you can choose to have icons for the people on the side. This is crazy stuff that I think we could spend a lot of time in VR once we have this basic data to play with.
Yes, to a degree. I mean, there's the counterbalance to that is, yes, we can say, oh, I can see all the things geographically, but do we actually? I mean, so you can theoretically build everything, but it has to be built. And the things, part of it is saying at this stage, if you're thinking practical demo terms, which aspects of it are worth getting past the barest bones, so that you can actually explain to a much more doubting, wider audience that there's something useful there. Because the sort of slight danger is that, especially probably the more educated end of the audience, people say, well, yeah, it's fine, it's great, but you know, look, I have a computer, it does all this stuff already. So it comes back to the singers having taken. So the point is, when I say, what do we do with it? Having had a hand in helping make Visual Meta, I understand what it's for, and I have a strong belief in it. I'm just trying to think, what tasks should we set ourselves to do?
Yeah,
and I'm also wondering if the data that Adam has at the moment includes. Another useful thing is that David Lebeau went through, and it may only be in his highlighter system at the moment, but he's done a whole lot of keywording or thematic tagging, if you will, of the documents that would usefully be added back into whatever data set Adam's got and was showing you, because that's another interesting sort of thematic stranding that exactly the sort of way where a more malleable display.
Mark, to address your question, what I referred to quite a bit earlier is there are many things we can do in VR, and I think everybody here should express what they want to do and see if there's an overlap. But in this particular context, what I'm talking about is augmenting someone's ability to write a thing where they define the details, the whole concept thing, and then publish that in a frozen form where someone in VR can read that linearly if they want to, but also all that extra highlighted bits, all the visual metadata is accessible for them to view in flexible ways. So they're reading something and they come across, and I think this is very Ted Nelson visually. You know, you come across, here is bracket 126, you click on that or whatever, and then that document, there's a line to it, you see it floating in the background, you can choose to view the whole thing or not. So Visual Meta actually gives us a lot of data to interact with. And that's all I'm saying. So I think that in a flow, as one of the things to do, one person reading one document written by one other person actually has a huge amount of actual real interactions and demo. Because as Doug used to say, well, I actually know my teacher, Ed Leahy, used to say, don't tell them, show them. Doug only ever made progress with a demo. This is one opportunity we have for a demo. I'm willing to support many others, but this is what I was talking about. Yeah, Adam, Mr. Mute.
The thing is that I'm in my VR honeymoon phase right now. So I get so excited by the things you can experiment with, especially where, like hands, spatial audio. I really, now when I've tried spatial audio a bit more with you, Frode, and it's really important to place, it's so ear-opening to actually have spatial audio. It opened a new thing for me here, just as with the hands, actually seeing your hands and pinching things and taking things and enlarging things with your hands in the different apps and even in the browser. To me, that is fantastic. And it also, nothing, hold on, Frode.
Sorry, didn't realize it was visible yet, sorry.
Don't do graffiti when I speak, I'm easily distracted. And the good thing here with VR is that there are so many or so few fixed interactions in place when it comes to text or even the hand gestures and what they mean, and there is no overriding system telling you what to do. Like in every operating system, you often have to fight if you want to do something novel or a bit more, maybe explore something better. You have to fight and try to disable and come around the inbuilt functions, like text selection in the browser. If you want to do something different with text selection, you almost have to render every character by yourself on a canvas idea to really fight. So in VR, that is open, and we have the opportunity to, and many things don't translate well, like text selection in VR. You have your hands and controllers. It's not obvious how you do it, but if we give the technologists, I'm one of them, of course, but too much time, they will translate everything from ordinary operating systems into flat canvases with awkward text selection and not using the high fidelity hands, for example, or slightly more analog. So to me, it's much more urgent to get better interactions, new embodied interactions into VR than to doing the kind of bringing in Wikipedia, because I think that is easier to do later on. So it's much more urgent to find the user interfaces than to do the slightly more visual work.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think Brandel agrees with you because he's doing a lot of that. I think we should do that, but I also think it's important that it's somehow based on real data, because otherwise it becomes very removed from the world, and that's why something like Visual Meta might be part of it, as in at least you know what some of the data is there. Anyway, maybe guys, I just saw this thing come out. We should all meet in here. It's one of those multiplayer run around, and it looks very polished. It's very gameish, but we all have Oculus now. It's £23, so it's not cheap. But then we can do some swimming, jumping, and spatial audio, and that's something to consider anyway, that we meet in a few of these spaces and see how it feels. As long as we don't walk into each other, Adam.
I was just thinking,
something that.
Go ahead, Brendan.
But that's something that slow mirror demo that I produced a while ago is for being able to demonstrate for people and for in a safe space for themselves, is just how intrusive and how transgressive people are able to be, because it must actually happen to you. You basically wouldn't believe it. So yeah, it's neat to know that you had that experience and can be aware of the way in which it needs to, that the concern needs to be brought to bear against the way that co-presence can occur within sort of a co-located virtual space, because there are all sorts of real crazy rules that we've set up for ourselves.
You might have two Oculus boundaries. One is sort of, as it were, the outside of the room, or the edge of the room, and then depending on how introvert or extrovert you are, you have another boundary which is either sort of around you or is also out of the room.
So, guys, I have to go. It's past the hour and I have to feed the family. But Brandel, can you please on our blog add some of links to the real VR experiences you have, so we can go into Oculus and experience what you built? That would be really, really appreciated. Because if you add it there, then once you're on that page, you just click and you're in. And
sure, that's a good point. Okay, I can do it. I'll send a link to the, what's it called, Sneaky. This is the link for the Oculus experience, or actually co-present thing. So if anybody jumps on there, then you'll have the ability to move a thing around, and you'll see my camera and my ball. But also, if you do this on a Quest, then you'll have your camera. Whoever's in there, whoever's blue right now, you presumably see my camera. You'll also see my hands, and they'll be colored the same color as my ball. And it's just a very, very sort of basic first foray into making use of a WebSocket interface to be able to transmit this data. It's not as fast in terms of the latency as I would like. One of the things I'm looking at is making use of a binary socket or a pure connection, such that it doesn't need to be coming through and multicast to everybody.
Did you make this? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Then I am tagging you. Okay, I just added it to our website. What's it called? Sneaky VR paste?
It's called various. No, so I didn't choose the name. That's something that that just comes as a consequence of making use of the free tier of glitch servers.
Oh, okay. So what do you call it? This thing?
It's just it's a multiplayer boilerplate.
Okay, interesting.
I'm very interested as a next step to because I said to Brendel that I was going to look into multiplayer, but I had nothing to multiplayer, so that is why I'm doing something light textual kind of drag and drop from text and actually getting text in there to multiplayer with it was obviously a first step. So I'm very interested to get the multiplayer into that multiplayer thing because that's...
If you have a glitch account, then I can show you, give you admin rights to the project so that you can pull it down and take a look at it. It's just using Node Express and then Socket.io to be able to do the connections.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wanted to have something sort of simple enough to be able to branch off and do more refined and specific things.
That's super cool, and we should get some. I looked into WebRTC. Is it called RTC?
WebRTC.
No? RTC, yeah. I looked into that, and it's doable. It's just a lot of work, but it's not extreme work. So we should be able to do it. I've been playing with an idea that you doing. I want to try hands, so I want to run an idea with you quickly here, just kind of being a traditional typesetter with actual type, metallic type, but you have words instead. So you have lots of, because in VR you can have many boxes, not just uppercase, lowercase boxes with type, but you can have words, and you can also have words in different layers as well. So you don't have to respect the physical boundaries. You can have words in different layers and just go down deeper to get new words, or go through a letter to get combinations of for a word. So you have so I want to play with the idea that you pick word and put them together with your hands from a kind of a typography, old school typography. And also that you could take a word and dip it into a kind of a synonym bowl and get the synonyms for it. So it's really hands-on, not just that you click on a symbol, the synonyms of, but so it's really everything is done with hands. You dip word, and you also took words and rip them apart and put them together as units.
Yes.
So I looked at your what was that called? The
Late text editor.
Yeah. So even that, but even more, removing the boxes and making the word floating, so it's even good. So you could like twist off the word. I really liked your demo. It's
I'm now imagining Adam in a virtual letterpress shop.
In a sweatshop. In a sweatshop,
I go
writing.
to work and I make stuff on a letterpress.
Yeah, in a sweatshop, we're making essays for Frodo.
Yes. And suddenly you find you are in a virtual sweatshop working for somebody else.
Could be, but I found that idea. Do you have any ideas? What you could do more there? But I find the idea of actually breaking sentences apart by pinching it at the break point and taking it apart would be very interesting, instead of kind of cutting it with a tool, but actually ripping it apart with the two pinches, or putting it together as a just an idea that.
By the way, guys,
No,
just
I see your hand.
inside that space now, Brandel, that you made, listening to you guys, but I'm in that space.
Yes, no, I can see you on my 2D thing. I might be able to jump in and be able to see you as well in the 3D space. I know. I agree, Adam. I think, one of the things that I was really excited with, I don't know if you saw Smart Triangle, but the idea of making a calculator with no buttons and actually representing those things visually sort of points to the fact that the mechanism through which you undertake a task doesn't need to be as tightly bound to the textual representations that we make use of today. And so, to that end, something that I've been playing, have played with a lot is what is Photoshop for text. And so having something like an opacity slider, which dictates not actually the sort of graphical opacity, but the textual opacity. So, taking a list of synonyms from a thesaurus and replacing sort of simpler words with more opaque ones, my father's been involved in government and NGOs and stuff like that, and so they always say, why use a 50-cent word when a $2 word will do? And so being able to have an opacity slider that you can gesturally manipulate in order to sort of ramp things up or down, I think is really interesting. As well as things like in situ thesaurus kind of alternative recommendations and things are very appealing. So gestural manipulation of what are considered to be textual things help to recognize that writing per se is not the process of inscribing specific glyphs onto a thing or punching keys, but the process of codifying thought in a way that can be represented and retrieved by other people at a different time.
That's beautiful. Yes. Sorry.
And so, no, I'm glad you like it. And so that means that what writing is, as well as being the most important thing that humanity has ever done, will continue to be, but that we got it wrong. We're vastly too specific with regard to what it actually is as a core activity. And this is an opportunity to go, no, we write by resolving thought, and we can resolve thought by dipping stuff in a synonym bowl. I love it.
Well, it sounds too, so, maths, which eludes a vast amount of humanity past the most simple level, there's something else that's ripe in that sense, for whether it's a closer interaction. So if you need to understand a bit of geometry or calculus or whatever, doing something, and that is, in fairness, quite well touched on in, what's his name's?
Victor.
Brett Victor's thing, and I thought he was spot on there.
Well, he's much more confluent in mathematical concepts than he is in education or information, even in communication per se. I mean, he's no slouch in terms of public speaking, right? But in terms of his actual academic understanding, what it is to educate and to communicate, not quite the same. So yeah, I agree. Cool. So yeah, Adam, if you want to send me, or if you're on Glitch already, then I can give you the access to the code base. I mean, everybody can. It's not that it's private or anything, but you do, I believe, need to have a Glitch account, which is free.
I will get one. I'm not there yet, but I will. I'll get one and email you. Yeah.
Yeah. So whenever anybody gets those things, then they can take a look at it, and you don't need to be a developer to want it, because you can also fork it and then give it to other people and stuff. I'm not concerned about it. I just wanted some bare bones thing to start being able to reason with these things and kind of make it communicate. Another thing that I'm really excited by is the fact that I realized that pressure sensitivity is available in Chrome nowadays, so that I can use my Wacom. And I can actually, with this, I can use my Wacom and a virtual reality headset at the same time, cobble those things together and have a really, really high fidelity drawing environment to whatever extent I desire. So, there's just so many incredible opportunities.
One thing when I have you here on the phone, so pass-through is currently, it's not available, but I wonder what the hacky solution would be. I wonder if one solution would be to stream a video feed from a kind of a duct tape Raspberry Pi Zero to your with the camera module. I have one laying around here, so duct tape it to the headset to actually pass it through a laggy web connection. That would be one way to kind of get, because I want to see my iPad with the pencil to get it also has pressure sensitive in some way, kind of, and also this keyboard, and so to get the keyboard in there when you need a discrete device.
Well, iPad actually also gives you the three degree of freedom orientation information. So you'd be able to understand not just the pressure sensitivity on the surface, but also the tilt.
I played around with it. It would be excellent to write with it in the air, but through your hand. Okay, I have to go to my family as well now. It's Friday evening here, and I've skipped out.
And a very quick passing thing on a practical note is just if there's anything in terms of parsing the virtual meta, by all means give me a prod. At the conceptual end, I can consult, but if it's just why is there a bracket here when there shouldn't be or something, I probably might be a better starting point, as I'm responsible for some of that.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, and I really, Mark, I'm sure we will get both Frodo's visual meta in there, and I've parsed PDFs and make rectangles of it, but it's non-interactive. I can't really select text because it's really hard to find out which character it is in practice. But it's doable, but it will be a lot of work to just do that part.
I'll also
and with Mark, with your data set, I am sure we will get to visualize that data set, the hypertext data set, in some way in 3 dimensions. I think it's very suited for that, so we will do that. It's just that I'm so into the embodiment parts and all the new. It's not just shiny tools, but getting your hands back. It's really important for me. At some point, we may get the eyes and feet back as well. I think feet are completely forgotten. Just the dancers in the world that like the feet, but that's for later.
Okay.
Well, Adam, it's really, really, really important to hear you say that. I mean, I'm raising a child, and he is a bit of a dancer, and I don't want that to be lost either. Of course, a lot of the work we can do sitting down. So, that's a whole different thing. And then we have the issues with movements. But, and also you said earlier, Frode's visual meta, and it makes me feel a bit horrible when you say that, even though I know that I kind of came up with it, but it's an invention that is so obvious that I hope it's something we can really share. And it's only one way of one communication medium of things. So if you want to change what visual meta is, let's do that together. But anyway.
Yeah, but it is. I see it as a thing at the end of a PDF, because metadata is not your invention or anyone's invention. It's always been there everywhere. After the first glyph stroke or a stone or a leather burning or a painting in 50 years ago, we had metadata in some way. So and I worked with metadata and RDF, and so RDF database. So yeah, I feel that visual meta is your thing, while metadata is everyone's thing. That's my distinction.
That kind of makes sense. However, it's worse than that, because if you go back to Mesopotamia and you look at the origins of cuneiform, what we call today the colophon, or however you pronounce it, that was actually from them. At the end of the document, it would say this was written by scribe so and so, working for so and so. So the very first. And
he didn't pay me.
Yeah, no, exactly. There can be little comments like that. That's exactly right. So now it only in the 1800s it moved to the front of the book. So all I'm trying to do is, if they can say what it is, we can say what it is. Anyway, the interactions in the space are important, and I hope to see you guys in this gamey thing. After dinner, I'm probably going to go in there a little bit and just move around, and it's just not my kind of world, but it's got great reviews, so maybe it's something we can do a quest.
Have you tried Hand Physics Lab?
No, but I will do that.
Try that, because it shows what you can do with the hands and to which fidelity. Remember to have good lighting, because the Oculus has a camera-based hand tracking thing, which means that to get good contrast for the camera and the computer to work with, you have to have good lighting. So don't sit in the dark closet when you do this.
No, I have noticed that. That's been an issue. It's actually once told me, hello, turn the lights on.
Okay.
This was lovely, guys. Maybe see you in the VR space. Look forward to Monday.
Okay, take care. Bye.